Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. Have you ever heard of a people who were born out of an episode marked by sin and shame, but who over time became one of the cruelest enemies of God's people? This is a story that begins right after the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, passes through acts of human despair, reaches bloody wars and idolatry, and ends wrapped in prophecies of judgment and destruction. Today we will explore the history of the Ammonites, descendants of Ben-Ami, the son of Lot, a people whose origin is shrouded in shadows, treacherous alliances, and a foretold destiny of ruin. It is an account that shows us how rash decisions can echo for centuries and alter the course of entire nations. It all begins in a desolate setting, where the marks of destruction still lingered as a reminder of divine judgment. After the tragic end of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities that had become symbols of corruption, violence, and degrading practices, the biblical narrative presents the escape of Lot, Abraham's nephew. He was spared not because of his own merit, but solely by the mercy of God, who extended his compassion to preserve his life and that of his two daughters. The small family, now without a wife and mother, found refuge in a cave in the mountains, far from any human contact, in complete isolation. The fear that all of humanity had been consumed by divine judgment dominated their hearts, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and despair amid the silence of those rocks. In this dark and lonely environment, Lot's daughters began reasoning out of panic and lack of faith. Believing there was no man left on earth to give them offspring and ensure the continuation of their family line, they conceived a desperate plan. Driven by fear and unbelief, they decided to take destiny into their own hands in a sinful way. They made their father drunk with wine, stripping him of clarity of thought and control over his actions. On separate nights, each lay with him without Lot being aware of what was happening. Thus, an act born out of fear and lack of trust in God became the origin of two entire nations. From the elder daughter came Moab, whose name would give rise to the Moabites, a people who would later appear in constant conflict with Israel. From the younger daughter came Ben-Ami, whose name, son of my people, already bore the mark of a tainted story and a morally shameful beginning. From him descended the Ammonites. From conception, this people carried a spiritual and moral burden that followed them like a shadow, a direct consequence of human choices made out of fear rather than trust in the Creator. This account, recorded in Genesis 19, serves as a reminder of how the origins of a nation can be tied to deep errors and yet still be part of the greater design of God's purposes. Despite the shame associated with their beginning, God did not prevent this lineage from multiplying. The Ammonites established themselves and grew into an organized people, occupying territories and leaving their mark on the region's history. However, the choices they would make in the following centuries would lead them further and further from the will of the Lord. It is interesting to note that, even with their stained origin, the Ammonites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, creating a direct kinship connection with Israel. This blood tie could have been a path to closeness and alliance, but what unfolded was quite the opposite. Over time, the memory of that family relationship faded in the face of hostility, and the Ammonites became staunch opponents, declared and constant enemies of God's chosen people. In the early stages of Israel's journey, soon after leaving Egypt, God gave specific instructions about how to deal with different peoples. Among these instructions was the prohibition of attacking the Ammonites or taking their land, for those territories had already been given by God as a legitimate inheritance to Lot's descendants. This command, recorded in Deuteronomy 2, shows that despite the controversial origin of the Ammonites and the rebellious future that awaited them, divine mercy was still manifested toward them. The Lord did not ignore genealogy nor the promise previously made, preserving a place for that people within the broader plan of history. The Ammonites settled in a strategically valuable area, located east of the Jordan River, in a region that today largely corresponds to modern-day Jordan. Their capital, Rabbah, became a center of power and significance, and its name remains alive in today's city of Amman, which still carries in its identity the memory of that ancient nation. This privileged location gave them control over important trade routes and access to defensive points that would become crucial in future conflicts. They were not a scattered or disorganized group. On the contrary, they structured themselves as a society that, even while maintaining some nomadic elements, possessed prepared armies, determined leaders, and a geographical base that granted them both economic and military advantage. Over time, the relationship between the Ammonites and the Israelites ceased to be merely distant and became increasingly tense. The family bond through Lot, which could have fostered cooperation and fraternity, was not enough to build a bridge between the two peoples. The Ammonites positioned themselves in opposition, preferring to form alliances with Israel's declared enemies. This estrangement was not limited to political or territorial issues. It also reached the spiritual realm, for the Ammonites rejected divine instructions and embraced idolatrous practices, plunging into customs and cults that directly defied the will of God. In this way, they forged an identity that not only separated them from Israel, but placed them in constant antagonism against the people chosen by the Lord. This hostility became evident at decisive moments in Israel's journey through the wilderness. In a time of extreme need, when Israel was suffering from hunger and thirst during their long marches, one might have expected at least a basic gesture of solidarity from the Ammonites, something consistent with the blood ties they shared. Yet instead of extending a hand, they refused even to provide bread and water. What could have been a simple act of hospitality became proof of the contempt and indifference they harbored toward the Israelites. This seemingly small refusal carried deep symbolic weight. It showed that the Ammonites did not see themselves as brothers or partners, but as rivals to be weakened, reinforcing a barrier that from then on would translate into centuries of conflict and mistrust. The hostility of the Ammonites was not limited to refusing to help Israel in their initial journey. They went beyond indifference and chose to join other peoples in conspiracies against the nation chosen by God. Alongside the Moabites and Midianites, they formed treacherous alliances with the goal of weakening and even annihilating Israel. This stance made it clear that it was not merely about territorial or political disputes, but a conscious decision to stand against God's purpose. Each time the Ammonites aligned themselves with Israel's enemies, they reinforced their position as opponents, not only of a people, but of the very God who sustained them. It was in this climate of growing animosity that a striking episode occurred. The Ammonites, together with the Moabites, resorted to a perverse spiritual measure. They hired Balaam, a diviner known for invoking curses, to curse Israel. The account, recorded in the Book of Numbers, goes beyond an indirect act of war. It represents a direct affront to the Lord, for they sought to neutralize God's protection over his people through occult practices. The attempt failed, for God turned the curses into blessings, but the seriousness of the act brought lasting consequences. In Deuteronomy 23, it was decreed that no Ammonite or Moabite could enter the assembly of the Lord up to the 10th generation, in remembrance of their betrayal and refusal to offer hospitality in Israel's time of greatest need. This judgment revealed the depth of the problem. The rivalry was not circumstantial. It was not confined to disputes over borders or economic influence. It had deep spiritual roots. The Ammonites had become direct enemies of what God was building through Israel. Their attitudes, alliances, and practices revealed not merely hostility toward a people, but rebellion against the divine plan itself. Thus, from being descendants of Lot and relatives of Abraham, they came to bear the identity of historical and spiritual antagonists, repeatedly remembered in Scripture as opponents of the will of God. Their hostility, however, was not restricted to military battles or political conspiracies. It was ingrained in the very religion of the Ammonites. Their chief god was Milcom, also called Molech, a cruel deity associated with rituals of human sacrifice. Worship of this idol often required the offering of children in holocausts, a practice considered an abomination before the Lord. Altars were built for such rites, and their violence directly shocked and defied God's commandments. For this reason, God repeatedly warned Israel never to be influenced by these cults. making it clear that such practices not only corrupted faith, but also brought judgment upon those who embraced them. Over the centuries, however, Ammonite influence eventually penetrated even among the Israelites themselves. One of the most tragic moments of this process took place during the reign of Solomon. Despite his renowned wisdom and the prosperity he received as a blessing from God, the king opened the door to marital alliances with foreign women, among them Ammonites. These wives brought with them their gods and rituals, and in time managed to exert influence over the king's heart. In his old age, Solomon gave in to their pressures and not only tolerated the worship of Milcom and other foreign deities, but even participated in it. This act symbolized a departure from the standard established by the Lord and inaugurated a period of spiritual decline that would affect the entire kingdom. The most emblematic case of Ammonite infiltration in Israel was that of Naamah, an Ammonite woman who became Solomon's wife and the mother of Rehoboam, heir to the throne. To please her, the king made dangerous concessions, allowing the construction of altars in Jerusalem dedicated to Milcom and other foreign gods. The gravity of this act is enormous. The very man who had devoted his life to building the temple of the Lord, the spiritual center of Israel, authorized the holy city to be contaminated with pagan practices. This contradiction marked one of the greatest spiritual downfalls in the kingdom's history, generating consequences that would echo for generations. The problem was not confined to the royal palace. Solomon's attitude opened spiritual breaches that allowed idolatry to penetrate the very heart of the kingdom of Israel. What began as seemingly small concessions turned into permanent altars, public rituals, and practices that corrupted the people's faith. The contamination was so severe that centuries later, King Josiah had to take radical measures to restore purity in worship. He destroyed altars, eliminated objects used in pagan rituals, and redirected the nation to the exclusive worship of the Lord. The fact that such reforms were necessary shows how deeply Ammonite influence had taken root in Israel's spiritual and cultural life. The idolatry of the Ammonites, therefore, was not just an external problem confined to the borders of another land. It had concrete, internal, and destructive effects on Israel. Every altar built, every practice imported, every concession made by spiritually weakened leaders undermined the people's faithfulness to God and brought far-reaching consequences. This religious aspect, added to political and military hostilities, made the Ammonites a persistent enemy, capable of attacking Israel on every occasion front, by the sword or by spiritual seduction. During the period of the Judges, this rivalry reached new heights. The Ammonites joined forces with the Moabites and Amalekites in an oppressive alliance that subjugated Israel for 18 years. It was a time of suffering and humiliation when the people felt firsthand the weight of living under enemy domination. Yet even in the midst of discipline and judgment, God did not break his covenant. He raised up Jephthah, an unlikely leader, rejected even by his own family, to lead the deliverance. Under his command, Israel defeated the Ammonites, once again showing that despite Israel's unfaithfulness, the Lord remained faithful and intervened on behalf of his people. Years later, in the period of the monarchy, the Ammonites once again stood out for their hostility. A decisive episode occurred at the very beginning of Saul's reign. The city of Jabesh-Gilead was besieged by the Ammonites, who imposed humiliating conditions for its surrender, threatening to disgrace and enslave all its inhabitants. This provocation was decisive for Saul, newly anointed to fully assume his role as king. He summoned the tribes, gathered an army, and marched against the enemies, obtaining a decisive victory. The defeat of the Ammonites not only saved Jabesh-Gilead, but also consolidated Saul's authority and confirmed before all Israel that God was with him at the start of his reign. However, Ammonite hostility was not easily extinguished. Even after so many accumulated defeats throughout their history, they maintained a confrontational posture. During the reign of David, an episode that could have been only a diplomatic gesture turned into yet another bloody conflict. When the king of Israel sent messengers with the intent of consoling Hanun, the new Ammonite ruler, upon the death of his father, the goodwill gesture was received with distrust and suspicion. Hanun, swayed by advisors who sowed doubt and fear, believed that the envoys had not come in solidarity but as spies. His response was dishonorable. He ordered half of their beards shaved, a sign of deep shame in their culture, and their garments cut off at the waist, leaving them exposed before all. The affront was not only against those men, but against David himself, for in ancient societies the honor of messengers was directly tied to the honor of the one who sent them. This public insult was like throwing a spark into a powder keg. Hanun quickly realized the gravity of his action, for the humiliation of the envoys amounted to a declaration of war. Knowing he could not face Israel's military power alone, he sought external reinforcements. He allied himself with Aramean kingdoms, hiring thousands of mercenary soldiers in an attempt to balance the forces. The battlefield soon filled with armed warriors, shields gleaming in the sun, and war cries echoing, creating a scene of extreme tension. Despite the magnitude of the enemy army, Israel had in its favor not only numbers, but also leadership and organization. Joab and Abishai, David's trusted and experienced generals, divided their troops strategically, ready to face both the Arameans and the Ammonites. The clash was fierce, marked by blood and courage. Yet Israelite discipline and strategy prevailed. The mercenaries, though numerous, lacked the cohesion of a united army, and little by little they were driven back. Israel's victory was not only military, but also moral, as it exposed the fragility of the alliances forged by the Ammonites. The outcome was devastating for the people of Hanun. Rabbah, their capital, was besieged for months until it finally fell under Israelite control. The city's riches were plundered, and as proof of triumph, David took for himself the crown of the enemy king, the ultimate symbol of sovereignty. For the Ammonites, this defeat was not only political, but also spiritual, for it demonstrated that their constant rebellion against God's purposes always resulted in humiliation. The biblical narrative presents these events not as mere accidents of war, but as evidence that God was directly judging the arrogance and idolatry of that people. Thus, each defeat was also a reminder that resisting the Lord produced nothing but downfall and shame. As the centuries passed, the decline of the Ammonites became inevitable. Even after suffering repeated defeats, they did not abandon their posture of enmity toward Israel. This stubbornness led them into continuous weakening. In the 6th century BC, they were subdued by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. They lost their autonomy, became vassals, and entered a process of irreversible decline. Even so, their hostility did not vanish. During the period of Jerusalem's reconstruction after the Babylonian exile, the Ammonites again showed opposition. The most striking example was Tobiah, the Ammonite governor, who played a central role in attempts to stop Nehemiah from rebuilding the city walls. Through mockery, conspiracies, and threats, he sought to intimidate and paralyze the work. Yet the resistance was useless, for God was with his people, and the reconstruction advanced despite the enemy's schemes. In time, the persistence of the Ammonites in confronting Israel did not bring them victories, but hastened their own ruin. Little by little, they lost territory, influence, and identity, diminishing in power and relevance until they virtually disappeared from history as a nation. The Bible does not present a sudden account of the disappearance of the Ammonites, but the prophets had already announced their end as part of God's judgment. In Ezekiel 25, we find the prophecy that the Lord would hand the Ammonites over as plunder to the peoples of the east. The cause was clear: their contempt when Judah fell, and their malicious joy over the suffering of God's people. This attitude of mockery was enough to draw upon them divine condemnation. Over time, this judgment was fulfilled. The power and identity of the Ammonites weakened to the point that they were gradually absorbed by other peoples, probably by Arab tribes inhabiting the region. There are still a few mentions in the intertestamental period, such as records of rulers descended from the Ammonites, like the so-called House of Tobiah, but their influence was already limited and no longer played a relevant role in the political or spiritual scene of the region. After the 2nd century BC, the name of the Ammonites, disappears completely from history. A people who began marked by an act of sin and despair, who lived in rebellion against God, ended in obscurity, exactly as the prophets had foretold. This trajectory, recorded in Scripture, is not only a historical record, but also a spiritual warning. The story of the Ammonites shows us how human decisions can generate consequences that span generations. An origin contaminated by sin was followed by centuries of idolatry, treacherous alliances, and open opposition to the people of God. Each choice reinforced their estrangement from the divine will until their destruction and oblivion became inevitable. This lesson still echoes today. Our actions do not affect only the present. They shape the future and build legacies that can be of blessing or of ruin. What we do now can open paths of life or raise walls of destruction for those who come after us. Just as the Ammonites became an example of warning, we are reminded that the choices of one generation can determine the destiny of many others. That is why it is essential that we choose to live righteously, with integrity, and in accordance with God's principles. Only then is it possible to break cycles of sin and build a solid heritage of faith, one capable of positively influencing the generations to come. The story of the Ammonites should not be read only as a distant record, but as a present-day warning. It shows us the price of rebellion and idolatry, but it also highlights the mercy and patience of the Lord, who in every age called his people to repentance and offered the chance to start again. As we reflect on this past, we understand the need not to repeat the same mistakes. May we learn from the fall of the Ammonites and walk a path that honors God, strengthens our faith, and blesses not only our lives, but also the lives of our descendants. The legacy we leave can be one of ruin or of hope, and that choice begins with the attitudes we take today. If this content brought you value and awakened your interest in learning more from the Scriptures, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. In doing so, you strengthen this community and continue receiving studies and reflections that edify. May the grace and blessing of the Lord reach you and your family in every area of life. See you soon.